Spare change usually just buys you a bad coffee. For Maeve, $3.42 bought her the undivided attention of the city's most dangerous man. She thought she was just helping a confused old man in a fluorescent-lit grocery checkout line. She didn't know the crumpled bills she handed the cashier would flag her face on a private, underworld surveillance network. Some good deeds go unpunished. Others drag you straight into the dark. Fluorescent lights hummed a dying yellow tune overhead. It was a miserable sound, the kind that drilled right into the base of your skull if you stood under it long enough. Maeve shifted her weight from her left foot to her right, staring blankly at the tabloid magazines lining the checkout aisle. Her boots were damp. November rain had a nasty habit of finding the cheap seams in fake leather. Ahead of her, the line was stalled. A heavy sigh escaped the woman directly in front of Maeve, followed by an aggressive check of a wristwatch. People in this part of the city were always in a hurry to get back to nowhere. Maeve leaned out slightly to see the hold-up. At the register stood an older man. He was small, slightly stooped, and aggressively fumbling through a worn leather wallet. "Sir, it's $23.40, the cashier said. She popped a bubble of pink gum, her eyes dead and fixed on the wall behind him. "You gave me a 20. Yes, I know." The old man's voice trembled. It wasn't the tremor of fear, but the frustrating, uncontrollable shake of age. His fingers, spotted and thin, scraped against the bottom of the empty coin pocket. "I had a 5. I know I had a 5. My boy gave it to me this morning." "Well, you don't have it now. Do you want me to put the milk back or the oranges?" The cruelty wasn't intentional. It was just the abrasive, sandpaper reality of minimum wage retail at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. But the words hit the old man hard. His shoulders slumped. He looked down at the small cluster of items on the black conveyor belt. A carton of whole milk, a bag of bruised oranges, a loaf of cheap white bread. "No, I need the milk," he mumbled, his hands dropping to his sides. He looked entirely lost. Maeve watched his face. There was a profound, suffocating embarrassment in his pale blue eyes. It was a look she knew intimately. It was the look her mother used to get when the card declined at the pharmacy. It was the crushing weight of public inadequacy. She didn't have money to burn. Her checking account currently boasted a laughable 2-digit balance, and her rent was due in 3 days. But she couldn't stand the smell of sour patience radiating from the line anymore, and she couldn't watch this man shrink under the cashier's flat stare. Maeve stepped out of her place in line. She walked past the annoyed woman and slapped a crumpled $5 bill onto the sticky black plastic of the conveyor belt. "Keep the change," Maeve said to the cashier. The cashier didn't look surprised, just bored. She snatched the 5, hit a button on the register, and the drawer shot open with a mechanical ding. The old man turned to Maeve. Up close, his frailty was even more apparent, yet there was something wildly incongruous about him. His wool coat was frayed at the cuffs, but the material was incredibly soft. Cashmere, maybe. And beneath the fraying sleeve, a heavy silver watch caught the harsh overhead light. It didn't look like a cheap knockoff. It looked heavy. Real. "You didn't have to do that, sweetheart," he said, his voice thickening. "It's $3, Maeve replied, keeping her tone light, brushing off the gratitude before it could get heavy. "I spend more than that on terrible coffee. Don't worry about it." People aren't usually this kind. He picked up his plastic bags, his hands still shaking slightly. "My grandson, he tells me the world is a wicked place. He worries. Too much. That boy worries." "The world is what it is," Maeve said. She offered a tired smile. "Have a good night, sir. Get home safe." "Henry," he said, nodding slowly. My name is Henry. Maeve? Henry smiled. It transformed his face, stripping away the confusion and leaving something remarkably sharp behind. Thank you, Maeve. Gabriel will be very pleased you helped me. He turned and shuffled out the automatic glass doors, disappearing into the wet, black night. Maeve didn't think twice about the name Gabriel. She just stepped back into line, paid for her frozen dinner and cheap coffee grounds, and braced herself for the cold walk back to her apartment. The walk took 20 minutes. The rain had turned to a fine, freezing mist. She let herself into her building, the lock sticking the way it always did, requiring a hard shoulder shove to turn the deadbolt. Her apartment smelled like dust and old radiator heat. She kicked off her wet boots, tossed her keys onto the chipped laminate counter, and microwaved her dinner. It was a completely ordinary night. A quiet, depressing, utterly normal Tuesday. She ate her food in silence, watching the rain streak the dirty glass of her single window. She didn't know that 3 miles away, in a sprawling, gated estate on the affluent north side of the city, a man was watching security footage of her face. She didn't know that the $5 bill she had casually tossed on a counter had just rewritten the trajectory of her entire life. Tuesday nights at the Rusty Anchor were an exercise in slow, agonizing boredom. The dive bar sat on a corner that the city's gentrification had somehow miraculously missed. It smelled perpetually of stale beer, bleach, and the ghosts of cigarettes smoked decades ago. Maeve wiped down the sticky mahogany bar with a damp rag, her mind entirely blank. She had been working here for 2 years, pouring cheap whiskey for men who had given up on better things. The clock on the wall above the registers ticked toward 11 p.m. Only 3 patrons sat in the booths, all regulars, all nursing half-empty glasses in comfortable silence. Then the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a loud noise that changed the room. It was the absolute, sudden absence of it. The faint hum of conversation died. The front door swung open, letting in a gust of freezing wind, and 3 men stepped inside. They didn't belong here. They wore dark, tailored overcoats that probably cost more than the bar's liquor license. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace, fanning out slightly as they assessed the room. 2 of them were built like freight trains, their eyes cold and scanning. The 3rd man walked between them. He was taller, leaner, and possessed a quiet, dense gravity that pulled the air right out of the room. He didn't look like a thug. He looked like an executive, except for the brutal, flat emptiness in his dark eyes. His hair was jet black, cut short and sharp. He unbuttoned his overcoat slowly, revealing a charcoal suit underneath. Maeve stopped wiping the bar. The rag grew cold in her hand. Her instincts, honed by years of living in bad neighborhoods, screamed at her to find a back door. This wasn't a robbery. Robbers were jumpy, loud, and desperate. These men were comfortable. They owned the space the second they crossed the threshold. The man in the center walked directly toward the bar. He pulled out a stool, the hinges squealing in protest under the sudden weight, and sat down opposite Maeve. "Can I help you?" Maeve asked. She hated how steady her voice sounded. It felt like a lie. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. The man looked at her. He really looked at her. He studied her face, taking in the cheap uniform shirt, the tired bags under her eyes, the rigid way she held her shoulders. "Maeve," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low, rough baritone. It sounded like gravel grinding against steel. "Do I know you?" "No," he said simply. He rested his hands on the bar. He wore no rings, but there was a faint, jagged scar crossing the back of his left hand. "My name is Gabriel Rossi." The name hit the room like a physical blow. One of the regulars in the back booth suddenly stood up, dropped a 20 on the table, and practically sprinted for the door, keeping his head down. Gabriel's guards didn't even flinch. Maeve recognized the name. You didn't live in this city without knowing the Rossi family. They owned the shipping yards. They owned the unions. They owned a significant portion of the politicians. They were old money, built on old blood. "What can I get you, Mr. Rossi?" Maeve asked, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "We only have 2 beers on tap, and I doubt you drink rail whiskey." Gabriel didn't smile. "I'm not here for a drink." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. Maeve tensed, half expecting a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a thick, sealed white envelope and slid it across the sticky mahogany until it rested inches from her hand. "My grandfather," Gabriel said quietly, "has vascular dementia. It comes and goes. Some days he's perfectly sharp. Other days he thinks it's 1985, and he needs to walk down to the corner store to buy milk for my father. The grocery store. The old man in the frayed coat. Henry." Maeve stared at the envelope. "He slipped his security detail yesterday evening," Gabriel continued, his voice tightening slightly. It was the first crack in his stone facade. "He walked 12 blocks in the rain. We were tearing the neighborhood apart looking for him. By the time we tracked his watch's GPS, he was already walking back." Gabriel leaned forward. The scent of cold air, expensive cedar cologne, and something faintly metallic washed over her. "My men pulled the security footage from the grocery store. I saw what happened. I saw the cashier humiliate him, and I saw you." "I just paid for his milk," Maeve said, her voice dry. "It was $3. It's not a big deal." "It is a big deal," Gabriel corrected sharply. "In my world, nobody does something for nothing. People exploit weakness. They don't cover a stranger's grocery bill out of the goodness of their hearts. Especially not people who look like they need the $5 more than he did." Maeve felt a flash of hot, defensive anger burn through her fear. "Excuse me? You're working in a failing bar, your shoes are falling apart, and you walk home to a subsidized apartment," Gabriel listed off with clinical precision. "You need money." He tapped the envelope. "There is $20,000 in there. Cash. It's a thank you. Take it." Maeve looked at the thick, white envelope. $20,000. It would clear her debts. It would fix her life. It was sitting right there. She looked up from the envelope to Gabriel Rossi's flat, expecting eyes. He thought he had her figured out. He thought everyone had a price, and he had just met hers. Maeve reached out. She didn't pick up the envelope. Instead, she placed 2 fingers on top of it and slid it firmly back across the bar until it hit Gabriel's hand. "I don't want your money," Maeve said. Her voice was quiet, but it held no tremble now. Gabriel frowned. The slight narrowing of his eyes was the most dangerous thing she had seen all night. "Excuse me." "It was $3, Maeve repeated, picking up her damp rag. "I did it because I wanted to go home, and he was holding up the line. I don't need a reward, and I definitely don't want to owe a favor to a guy like you. So, take your envelope, Mr. Rossi, and have a good night." Gabriel stared at her. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The 2 guards by the door shifted, their hands dropping subtly toward their waistbands. Gabriel raised a hand, a sharp, minimal gesture that froze his men instantly. He looked down at the rejected envelope, then back up at Maeve. Slowly, an unfamiliar expression crossed his face. It wasn't anger, it was curiosity. "You don't want to owe me," Gabriel repeated softly, testing the words on his tongue. "No." He picked up the envelope and slipped it back into his jacket. He didn't break eye contact. "All right, Maeve," Gabriel said, standing up. The stool didn't squeal this time. "I won't force you to take it, but I don't like unpaid debts, and I certainly don't like leaving loose ends." He turned and walked toward the door. His men opened it before he reached it. The freezing wind whipped through the bar once more, and then they were gone, swallowed by the night. Maeve stood frozen behind the bar, her hands shaking so hard she had to grip the wood to steady herself. She had just rejected $20,000 from a mafia boss. She thought she was being smart. She thought she was cutting the tie. She was wrong. She had just tied the knot. Paranoia is a quiet disease. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It makes you check the deadbolt 3 times instead of 2. It makes you memorize the license plates of the cars parked on your street. For 3 days after the encounter at the Rusty Anchor, Maeve lived in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the other shoe to drop. You didn't tell a man like Gabriel Rossi to take a hike without consequences. Thursday morning arrived with the pale, sickly light of a city struggling against winter. Maeve sat in the corner of a 24-hour laundromat, watching her faded work shirts tumble in the dryer. The place smelled of industrial bleach and cheap floral fabric softener. A fluorescent bulb flickered rhythmically above row 4, casting a twitchy, nervous strobe across the peeling linoleum floor. She was exhausted. Sleep had become a fragmented, elusive thing, broken by the memory of Gabriel's flat, dark eyes. The bell above the glass door chimed. Maeve didn't look up from her beat-up paperback. People drifted in and out of this place like ghosts. It wasn't until the heavy scent of cedar and cold rain overpowered the smell of bleach that her stomach dropped. Gabriel stood at the end of the aisle. He looked entirely absurd in this environment. He wore a dark navy wool coat over a charcoal turtleneck, the fabric hugging the broad lines of his shoulders. His shoes, polished black leather, probably cost more than the row of washing machines beside him. He wasn't flanked by guards this time. He was alone, and somehow that made him infinitely more intimidating. Maeve closed her book, marking the page with her thumb. "Are you stalking me, Mr. Rossi? Because I'm pretty sure there are laws about that, even for people who own the judges." Gabriel didn't smile. He walked slowly down the aisle, his gaze sweeping over the rusted coin machines, the overflowing trash bins, and finally settling on her. He stopped a few feet away, invading her space just enough to establish dominance, but keeping enough distance to avoid a physical threat. "My grandfather refused to eat his breakfast this morning," Gabriel said. His voice was a low rumble, blending with the rhythmic thumping of the dryers. Maeve blinked, completely derailed by the statement. She had braced herself for a threat, a bribe, or an eviction notice, not a dietary report. "I'm sorry. He has it in his head that the girl from the grocery store is in trouble," Gabriel continued, his jaw tightening. "Dementia is a cruel architect. It builds realities out of fragments. He remembers you paying for his groceries. He remembers my men bringing me the security footage. Now, he thinks you're starving because you gave him your last $5. He won't touch his food until he knows you're provided for." Maeve let out a harsh, involuntary laugh. It sounded scraped raw. "So you tracked me down to a laundromat in the worst ward of the city to tell me your grandfather is worried about my financial stability?" "I tracked you down," Gabriel said, leaning slightly against the vibrating metal of a washing machine, "because I have a problem I need to solve, and you are the crux of it." "I told you I don't want your money. I know what you told me." Gabriel's dark eyes locked onto hers, stripping away the defensive layers she tried to project. "I spent the last 3 days running a background check on you, Maeve." Her grip tightened on her book. "That's a massive invasion of privacy." "It's standard operating procedure," he countered smoothly. "You have $34 in your checking account. You're 2 months behind on your heating bill. Your mother died of ovarian cancer 3 years ago, leaving you drowning in medical debt that you are slowly, painfully trying to chip away at by pouring cheap liquor for alcoholics. The words felt like physical blows. He was laying out the pathetic, fragile anatomy of her life for them both to examine under the harsh laundromat lights. A flush of hot humiliation crept up Maeve's neck. "Stop," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I am simply stating facts. You are drowning." Gabriel reached into his coat pocket. He didn't pull out an envelope this time. He pulled out a small, heavy piece of cardstock. "I don't like owing debts. In my family, an unpaid debt is a vulnerability. It implies a lack of control. You did something for my blood. Now, I have to balance the ledger." He stepped forward and placed the card on top of her paperback. It was a business card, matte black, thick, with a single phone number printed in embossed silver ink. "I won't hand you cash. I see it insults your pride," Gabriel said, his tone shifting. It was less commanding now, threading with something dangerously close to respect. "But I own 3 legitimate restaurants downtown, the kind where a bottle of wine costs more than your monthly rent. I need a front-of-house manager for the one on 5th. The pay is triple what you make at the bar, with full health benefits." Maeve stared at the black card. It felt heavy, like a lead weight pressing into her hand. This wasn't charity. This was a calculated, strategic move. It was employment, but it was employment under his shadow. "Why?" Maeve asked, looking up. "Why go through all this trouble for a stranger?" "Because Henry asked me to," Gabriel replied instantly. But there was a hesitation in his eyes, a brief flicker of something unsettled. "And because I have never met someone who looks at a lifeline and spits in the face of the man throwing it. Call the number, or don't. But if you don't, Henry starves, and I will have to find a much less polite way to balance my ledger." He didn't wait for her answer. Gabriel turned and walked out, the bell chiming a cheerful goodbye as he vanished back into the grey city, leaving Maeve alone with the rhythmic thud of the dryer and a choice she never asked for. Fear has a specific metallic taste. It floods the back of your throat right before the adrenaline hits. Maeve knew the taste intimately. She tasted it now, choking on the damp, freezing air of the alleyway behind the rusty anchor. It had been 4 days since the laundromat. The black business card burned a hole in her coat pocket. She hadn't called the number. She had stubbornly clung to her miserable independence, pouring drinks and ignoring the creeping dread that she was making a catastrophic mistake. Tonight, the mistake caught up with her. She was dragging a heavy plastic garbage bag toward the rusted dumpster when the shadows near the brick wall detached themselves. 2 men. They didn't have the tailored, lethal elegance of Gabriel's security detail. They were rough, erratic, and smelled of stale sweat and cheap meth. "Look at this," the taller one rasped, stepping into the dim yellow pool of the security light. He held a switchblade. The blade caught the light, a wicked, slender sliver of silver. "Rossi's little charity project." Maeve dropped the trash bag. It hit the wet pavement with a heavy thud. She took a slow step backward, her eyes darting toward the back door of the bar. It was closed. Solid steel. No handle on the outside. "I don't know what you're talking about," Maeve said. "Keep the voice steady. Keep the eyes moving. Find a weapon, a broken bottle, a loose brick. Anything." "Don't play dumb, sweetheart," the shorter man giggled. It was a terrible, wet sound. "Word on the street is the Ice King himself sent his personal guard to check on a dive bar waitress. Rossi doesn't do favors. He doesn't have friends, which means you're either a liability or you're a weakness. We figure we can use a weakness." They were moving in, cutting off her escape route to the street. Maeve's breath hitched in her chest. Rejecting Gabriel's money hadn't severed her ties to him. It had painted a massive, glowing target on her back. In the underworld ecosystem, any anomaly was exploited. She was the anomaly. The tall man lunged, grabbing the collar of her cheap winter coat. Maeve screamed, throwing her weight backward and driving her knee up sharply. She caught him in the thigh. He grunted, his grip slipping, but he retaliated with a vicious backhand that caught her across the cheekbone. The force of the blow sent Maeve crashing into the metal side of the dumpster. Pain exploded behind her eyes, brilliant and blinding. She tasted blood. The man raised the switchblade, stepping over her. "Stupid bitch. Now we do this the hard way." He never finished the sentence. From the mouth of the alley, a shape moved with terrifying velocity. There was no shout, no warning, just the sickening wet crunch of bones snapping under immense pressure. Maeve blinked through the stars, exploding in her vision. The tall man was on the ground. He wasn't moving. His arm was bent at an impossible, grotesque angle. Standing over him was Gabriel Rossi. He didn't look like the tailored executive from the laundromat. He looked like violence incarnate. His overcoat was open, his posture coiled and brutal. The shorter man froze, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror as he recognized the man who had just shattered his partner. "Mr. Rossi," the man stammered, raising his hands, dropping his own knife. "We didn't know. We thought she was just—" Gabriel didn't speak. He stepped over the unconscious body on the ground, grabbed the second man by the throat, and slammed him backward into the brick wall. The impact knocked the breath from the man's lungs in a sharp hiss. Maeve pushed herself up against the dumpster, clutching her throbbing cheek. She watched, paralyzed, as Gabriel squeezed. The muscles in his back corded tight beneath his suit. The man's legs kicked frantically, his hands tearing uselessly at Gabriel's iron grip. Gabriel's face was an absolute void. There was no anger, no pleasure, just the clinical application of lethal force. "Gabriel, stop!" Maeve's voice was a ragged whisper. She wasn't even sure he heard her over the rain and the desperate gasps of the dying man. But he did. Gabriel froze. Slowly, methodically, he opened his hand. The man collapsed to the wet pavement, gasping violently, clutching his bruised throat. "If you ever look at her again," Gabriel said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection, "I will peel the skin from your face while you watch. Run." The man scrambled backward on his hands and knees, scrambling over his unconscious partner, before bolting into the dark street like a hunted animal. Silence descended on the alley, heavy and suffocating. Gabriel turned to face Maeve. His chest was heaving slightly. He reached into his coat and pulled out a pristine white handkerchief. He stepped toward her. Maeve flinched, pressing herself harder against the cold metal of the dumpster. Gabriel stopped. A muscle feathered in his jaw. He looked at her, cowering from him, looked at the blood swelling on her cheek, and then looked down at his own hands. For a fractured second, the Mafia boss vanished, replaced by a man looking at a disaster he couldn't buy his way out of. "You didn't call the number," Gabriel said quietly. "Would it have stopped them?" Maeve shot back, her voice shaking with adrenaline and pain. "They didn't want me, Gabriel. They wanted you. I'm just the bait." "I know." He closed the distance between them slowly, telegraphing his movements. He gently pressed the handkerchief against the cut on her cheekbone. His touch was jarringly soft. "That is why you are coming with me." "I'm not going anywhere with you." "Your stubbornness is going to get you killed, Maeve," Gabriel said, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You stepped into my world the second you paid for that milk. I tried to pay you off. You refused. I tried to employ you. You refused. You left me no clean options. He grabbed her hand, ignoring her resistance, and pulled her gently but firmly away from the dumpster. So now, Gabriel said, the gravel in his voice hardening into concrete, we do it my way. You belong to the Rossi family now, for your own protection. Money doesn't just buy comfort, it buys silence. The heavy armoured doors of Gabriel's SUV sealed shut with a soft, vacuum-like click, instantly cutting off the sounds of the freezing rain and the distant sirens of the city. Inside the vehicle, the silence was absolute. Maeve sat rigid against the black leather seat, holding the bloody handkerchief to her face. Her cheekbone throbbed in time with her rapid heartbeat. She stared out the tinted window, watching the neon signs of her neighborhood blur into the sleet. Gabriel sat across from her, his posture straight, his eyes fixed on a tablet in his lap. He had just shattered a man's arm and nearly crushed another's windpipe, yet his breathing was entirely even. He looked like a man reviewing a quarterly earnings report. I have a shift at the bar tomorrow, Maeve said. Her voice sounded thin, swallowed by the spacious interior of the car. Gabriel didn't look up from his screen. I bought the bar 20 minutes ago. You no longer work there. The sheer, casual absurdity of the statement punched the air right out of her lungs. You bought a bar, at midnight, because I have a shift. The current owner had gambling debts. The transfer was highly motivated. Gabriel swiped a finger across the glass. I told you, Maeve, you are a vulnerability. As long as you are walking the streets unprotected, my enemies will use you to get to me. I cannot allow that. So I'm a prisoner. You are a guest. He finally looked up. You will have a room, fresh food, and security. When the people who ordered that hit in the alley are identified and removed, you can go back to your life. Until then, you stay. They passed through the heavy iron gates of the Rossi estate 20 minutes later. The property sat on a sprawling cliffside, overlooking the dark, churning water of the bay. It was less a house, and more a fortress built of grey stone and reinforced glass. Cameras tracked the vehicle's progress up the winding driveway. Inside, the estate was cavernous and cold. The floors were polished marble that echoed sharply under Maeve's cheap, wet boots. Everything smelled of lemon polish and sterile air conditioning. There were no photographs, no clutter, no signs that human beings actually lived here. It looked like a museum exhibit of immense wealth. A man in a white medical coat was waiting in the foyer. Gabriel gestured toward Maeve. Fix her face. No narcotics unless she asks for them. The doctor guided her to a brightly lit side room, sitting her down on a leather exam chair. He cleaned the cut on her cheek with cold efficiency, applied butterfly closures, and handed her an ice pack. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what happened. In this house, people clearly knew better than to ask questions. When she emerged, Gabriel was standing at the base of a sweeping dual staircase. He had shed the overcoat, leaving him in the dark turtleneck and suit trousers. Without a word, he led her up the stairs and down a long, dimly lit corridor. He opened a heavy oak door and stepped aside. The guest room was larger than Maeve's entire apartment. A massive king-sized bed dominated the space, flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-lashed bay. A fire was already crackling in a stone hearth. "Your clothes are wet," Gabriel noted, his eyes dropping briefly to her shivering frame. "There is a wardrobe in the dressing room. The tags are still on. Wear what you want. Tomorrow, someone will collect your personal effects from your apartment. I don't want your clothes. I want my own things." "Your apartment was compromised the moment those men cornered you," Gabriel replied, his tone hardening. "They know where you live. They know your routines. Going back there is suicide. Accept the reality of your situation, Maeve. It will make this much easier." "And what about Henry?" she shot back. "Does he know you drag women off the street to balance your ledgers?" A shadow passed over Gabriel's face. It was the first genuine crack in his composure since the alley. "My grandfather is asleep. He had a difficult day. You will not disturb him." "Right, because the great Gabriel Rossi can control everything except a dying man's memory." It was a cruel thing to say. Maeve knew it the moment the words left her mouth. She was angry, terrified, and lashing out at the only target available. Gabriel stepped fully into the room. The air pressure seemed to change, dropping 10 degrees. He walked slowly toward her, stopping only when the toes of his expensive shoes nearly touched her damp boots. He looked down at her. "I control what I must to keep my family alive," Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. "I do terrible things to terrible people, so my grandfather can die in a warm bed instead of bleeding out in a warehouse. You think you understand my world because you pour drinks for losers and dodge muggers on your walk home. You know nothing." He turned on his heel. "Lock the door if it makes you feel better. The guards outside will ensure you aren't disturbed." The door clicked shut behind him. The lock engaged from the outside. Maeve stood alone in the center of the massive, beautiful room, the ice pack burning against her skin. She walked over to the window and looked out at the black water. She wasn't just a guest. She was a piece on a chessboard, completely at the mercy of a man who didn't know how to lose. 4 days in a fortress changes a person. The initial terror calcified into a dull, grinding frustration. The Rossi estate ran like a high-end military installation. Meals were delivered precisely at 8, 1, and 7. Maids materialized like ghosts to clean rooms and vanished just as quickly. The perimeter was patrolled by silent men in dark suits, carrying concealed weapons. Maeve refused to assimilate. She left the designer clothes hanging in the cedar-lined wardrobe, choosing instead to wash her cheap jeans and work shirt in the massive porcelain sink of her en-suite bathroom, hanging them over the heated towel racks to dry. She refused the trays of prime rib and seared scallops, walking down to the industrial kitchen at odd hours to make herself plain toast and black coffee. She was looking for friction. She needed to know the edges of her cage. It was Thursday morning, precisely 6 a.m. The kitchen was empty, entirely devoid of the bustling staff that usually arrived at 7. Maeve stood in her faded jeans, barefoot on the cold tile, waiting for the water in the kettle to boil. A shuffling sound broke the silence. Maeve turned. Standing in the archway was Henry. He looked significantly smaller than she remembered from the grocery store. He wore a heavy silk bathrobe, but his frame was drowning in it. His white hair was mussed, and his eyes held that terrible, glassy emptiness of a mind untethered from the present. "Maria," Henry called out, his voice frail and trembling. "Maria, the stove is cold. My father needs his coffee." Maria, not Gabriel. He was slipping backward by decades. Maeve didn't panic. You didn't work in a dive bar without learning how to handle people who weren't in their right minds. The strategy was always the same: agree, redirect, and anchor. "I'm sorry, Henry," Maeve said, keeping her voice incredibly soft and even. She stepped away from the kettle, keeping her hands visible. Maria stepped out for a moment. "I'm taking over the coffee." Henry blinked, staring at her. The confusion deepened, his brow furrowing. "You aren't Maria? Where is my coat? I need to go down to the docks, the shipment." He started to turn, his breathing growing shallow and panicked. "The boys at the dock, they won't unload without me. The docks are closed today due to the rain, Henry," Maeve lied smoothly, walking slowly toward him. She pulled out a heavy oak bar stool. The foreman called. Everyone went home. Why don't you sit down, and I'll bring you that coffee? He hesitated, looking toward the dark windows. The rain was, in fact, lashing against the glass. The physical evidence seemed to anchor him slightly. His shoulders dropped. Closed, he muttered. Closed. Good, my back hurts. He shuffled to the stool and sat down heavily. Maeve quickly fixed a mug of black coffee, adding 2 sugars just to give him something to taste, and slid it across the marble island. Henry wrapped his spotted hands around the warm ceramic. Thank you, sweetheart, he murmured. You're welcome. He doesn't know how to do it, you know, Henry said suddenly, staring into the black liquid. His voice shifted, sounding suddenly clearer, heavier. Who doesn't? Gabriel. Henry looked up, and for a fleeting second the fog cleared. The sharp, intelligent eyes of the patriarch returned. He knows how to build the walls. He knows how to shoot the wolves. But he doesn't know how to live inside the house. He thinks fear is the same thing as safety. Maeve went entirely still. The hairs on her arms stood up. Before she could answer, a shadow detached itself from the hallway. Gabriel stepped into the kitchen. He was fully dressed in a dark suit, his tie perfectly knotted. How long he had been standing there, watching her handle his grandfather, she had no idea. But his face was tight, his jaw clenched so hard, a muscle twitched near his ear. Grandpa, Gabriel said quietly, stepping forward. It's early. The doctor wants you resting until 8. Henry looked at Gabriel, the brief window of lucidity slamming shut. The old man smiled pleasantly. Good morning, son. This nice girl was just telling me the docks are closed. They are, Gabriel agreed smoothly, his eyes flicking to Maeve. There was a complex weight in his gaze, something caught between gratitude and intense irritation. Let's get you back upstairs. The floors down here are cold. He helped the old man up, his large hands incredibly gentle on Henry's fragile shoulders. As they reached the archway, Gabriel stopped and looked back at Maeve. My office. Tonight at 10, Gabriel commanded softly. We need to talk. The day dragged by. When the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10, Maeve pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of Gabriel's office. The room smelled of old leather, expensive scotch and wood smoke. Gabriel was sitting behind a massive desk, pouring amber liquid into 2 crystal glasses. He didn't look up as she entered. He just pushed one glass across the polished wood. I don't drink while I'm working, Maeve said, staying near the door. You aren't working, and neither am I. Gabriel picked up his glass, taking a slow sip. He looked exhausted. The brutal, untouchable armor was entirely gone, leaving behind a man who looked like he carried the weight of a crumbling empire. You handled him well this morning, Gabriel said, staring at the amber liquid. Better than the nurses. They panic when he forgets the year. They try to correct him. It just makes him agitated. You don't fight a current, Maeve said simply, walking closer to the desk, but refusing to sit. You swim parallel to it until you find a place to stand. My mother had rough days toward the end. The meds scrambled her. You learn how to navigate the delusion. Gabriel looked up at her. He studied the fading bruise on her cheek, the stubborn set of her jaw, the cheap clothes she stubbornly continued to wear. I owe you an apology, he said. The words sounded foreign in his mouth, as if he hadn't used them in a decade. I brought you here and treated you like a liability to be managed. I assumed you were fragile. I'm not fragile. I'm poor. There's a massive difference. Gabriel let out a short, quiet breath that might have been a laugh. Yes, there is. He set his glass down. The men in the alley were contractors. Hired by a rival family looking to probe my defenses. They are dead now. The threat is neutralized. Maeve's stomach dropped. The casual admission of murder chilled the room. So I can go. You can, Gabriel agreed slowly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. I will have a car take you back. I will buy you a new apartment. I will clear your debts. The ledger will be balanced. He was offering her exactly what she wanted. Freedom, independence, a clean break. But as Maeve looked at the man behind the desk, she remembered the way he had gently guided his confused grandfather out of the kitchen. She remembered the desperate, lonely look in Henry's eyes. She remembered Gabriel's quiet admission. I control what I must to keep my family alive. She didn't reach for the glass. She didn't turn toward the door. And who makes Henry his coffee tomorrow? Maeve asked. Gabriel's hand tightened around the edge of his desk. The silence between them stretched, thick and dangerous, shifting the ground entirely beneath their feet. Gabriel did not answer immediately. He sat perfectly still behind the massive mahogany desk, the amber liquid in his glass catching the dim light of the desk lamp. His dark eyes searched her face, looking for the trap. In his world, altruism was a myth. Every favor was a hook. Every concession was a calculated risk. You're volunteering to stay, Gabriel said slowly. It wasn't a question. He was testing the structural integrity of the concept. I am negotiating employment, Maeve corrected, crossing her arms. The heavy, expensive silence of the office pressed against her, but she refused to step back. You need someone to anchor Henry when his mind drifts. Your security details look at him like a broken piece of furniture. Your nurses treat him like a toddler. He is an old man losing his grip on reality, and he needs someone who knows how to hold his hand without stripping his dignity. Gabriel set his glass down. The soft click echoed loudly. And you believe you are uniquely qualified for this? I took care of my mother for 4 years, Maeve said, her voice dropping the defensive edge, settling into cold, hard fact. I know how to manage sundowning. I know how to check medications. And, more importantly, I am the only person in this fortress who isn't terrified of you. A faint, humorless smile touched the corner of Gabriel's mouth. It was a micro-expression, gone before it fully registered. You should be terrified of me, maybe, but I'm not. Maeve uncrossed her arms and placed her palms flat on his desk. I want a formal contract, fair market rate for a live-in care coordinator. I want a W-2. I want my medical debts paid off as a signing bonus, not a charity handout. And I want the freedom to come and go from this estate without 2 armed guerrillas following me to the pharmacy. Gabriel watched her hands on his desk. He looked at her chipped nail polish, the faint white scars on her knuckles from years of manual labor. Then he looked up at her face. The guerrillas stay, Gabriel countered smoothly. Non-negotiable. If you work for me, you are a target. They will ride in a separate vehicle. They will stay out of your line of sight. But they stay. Maeve considered this. It was a concession dressed as an order. Fine. Your debts will be cleared by tomorrow afternoon, Gabriel continued, his voice returning to that crisp, executive cadence. Your salary will be triple the market rate to compensate for the unorthodox nature of your employer. You answer only to me. You handle Henry. You manage his schedule. You tell the medical staff what to do. If they refuse, you tell me, and they will be replaced. Deal. He stood up. The sheer size of him dominated the room, casting a long shadow across the Persian rug. He extended his right hand. Maeve looked at it. The faint, jagged scar crossing his knuckles was fully visible now. She reached out and gripped his hand. His skin was warm, calloused, and his grip was firm without being crushing. It felt like shaking hands with a loaded gun. "Welcome to the family business, Maeve," Gabriel said quietly. Over the next 3 weeks, the dynamic within the stone fortress shifted. Maeve didn't just manage Henry, she inadvertently humanized the estate. She fired the lead nurse on day 4 for speaking to Henry in a patronizing baby voice. When the woman threatened to go to Gabriel, Maeve simply pointed to the door. Gabriel watched the entire exchange from the second-floor landing. He didn't intervene. The nurse packed her bags. Henry flourished. Maeve established a rigid routine, anchoring his days with familiar, tangible tasks. She bought him cheap 100-piece puzzles that they completed at the kitchen island. She played old radio broadcasts from the 1950s. She learned the exact ratio of cream to sugar he preferred. Gabriel became a ghost, haunting his own home. He left early, returning late into the night. Maeve caught glimpses of him, a dark figure standing by the window in the study, the smell of expensive cedar cologne lingering in the hallways, the quiet murmur of tense phone calls echoing from behind closed doors. They rarely spoke, but the silence between them was no longer hostile. It was observant. One evening, Maeve was sitting on the floor of the library, stitching a torn seam in Henry's favorite cashmere coat. The fire was burning low. The heavy double doors opened, and Gabriel stepped inside. He looked exhausted. His tie was loose, his collar unbuttoned, and a faint smear of dried blood stained the cuff of his white shirt. He didn't acknowledge the blood. Maeve didn't ask. Gabriel walked to the heavy leather armchair opposite her and collapsed into it. He closed his eyes, resting his head against the high back. "He ate a full dinner tonight," Maeve said quietly, biting off the end of her thread. "Roast chicken. He remembered your father's birthday." "Good," Gabriel murmured. His voice was thick with fatigue. "Thank you." Maeve looked at the blood on his cuff. She looked at the dark circles bruised under his eyes. He was a monster to the city outside these walls. He shattered bones and ruined lives. But sitting here, in the dim firelight, he just looked like a man slowly drowning under the weight of an invisible ocean. She folded the coat, placed it on the side table, and stood up. She walked to the small bar cart in the corner, poured 2 fingers of his expensive scotch into a crystal glass, and carried it over. She set it on the table beside him. Gabriel opened his eyes. He looked at the glass, then up at her. "You're paying me too much," Maeve said flatly. "I figured I should start bartending again to earn my keep." She walked out of the library, leaving him alone with the fire and the scotch. It was a small, almost insignificant gesture. But in the underworld, small things were exactly what eventually brought down the empires. Violence rarely announces itself with a polite knock. It rips the door off the hinges. December arrived with a brutal, biting cold that froze the bay into jagged plates of grey ice. Maeve was asleep, buried under the heavy down comforter of her guest room, when the alarms triggered. It wasn't a loud, shrieking siren. It was a low, vibrating hum that seemed to shake the very foundation of the stone estate, accompanied by the strobing pulse of red emergency lights in the hallway. Maeve threw off the covers. Her bare feet hit the cold, hardwood floor. She didn't freeze. The panic response she had honed on the streets kicked in, sharp and clinical. She grabbed the heavy brass lamp from her nightstand, wrapping the cord tightly around her wrist. She opened her bedroom door. The hallway was chaos in motion. Men in dark tactical gear were moving with silent, terrifying speed. The estate's security detail was fully mobilized. Assault rifles, usually hidden, were now raised and ready. The smell of cold air and raw adrenaline flooded the corridor. "Get back in your room," a guard barked, moving past her door. "Where is Henry?" Maeve demanded, gripping the brass lamp. Safe room, north wing, lock your door. Maeve ignored him. She dropped the lamp, sprinted down the hall, and took the back stairs toward the foyer. The front doors were blown wide open, the freezing wind howling into the pristine marble entryway. 3 SUVs were parked haphazardly on the front driveway, their doors flung open. 2 guards were dragging a man up the stone steps. It was Gabriel. His charcoal suit was ruined. The fabric was torn and soaked with a massive, spreading stain of dark, heavy crimson. His head slumped forward, his breathing coming in wet, ragged gasps. "Medical room! Move!" one of the guards screamed, completely dropping the usual professional stoicism. Maeve's heart slammed against her ribs. She didn't think, she just moved. She intercepted them at the base of the stairs, sliding her shoulder under Gabriel's free arm, taking his weight. He was incredibly heavy, a dead weight of dense muscle. Gabriel's head rolled to the side. His dark eyes flickered, struggling to focus. He saw her face. "Maeve," he grunted, blood staining his teeth. "Get out of the hall." "Shut up and walk," Maeve snapped, straining under his weight as they half-carried, half-dragged him down the corridor toward the sterile white room where the doctor had stitched her face weeks ago. They kicked the door open. The estate doctor was already there, snapping on blue latex gloves, his face pale and tight. "On the table, now," the doctor ordered. They hauled Gabriel onto the leather examination chair. He groaned, a deep, animalistic sound of pure agony as his back hit the surface. The doctor grabbed a pair of trauma shears and began cutting away the expensive wool of the suit jacket and the ruined shirt beneath. Maeve stood frozen at the foot of the chair. His left side was a mangled ruin. 2 gunshot wounds, one high in the shoulder, passing clean through. The other low in the abdomen. That was the bad one. Dark, arterial blood pulsed sluggishly from the ragged hole, pooling quickly on the black leather. "I need pressure on the stomach," the doctor yelled, turning to grab a tray of surgical instruments. "Now!" The guards hesitated. They were shooters, not medics. Maeve stepped forward. She grabbed a thick stack of sterile gauze from the counter, pressed it directly over the abdominal wound, and leaned her entire body weight onto her hands. Gabriel arched his back, a horrific strangled cry escaping his throat. His hands, slick with his own blood, blindly reached out and gripped Maeve's forearms. His fingers dug into her skin like iron clamps. "Look at me," Maeve ordered. Her voice was loud, slicing through the panic in the room. "Gabriel, look at me." His eyes snapped to hers. They were dilated, wild with pain and shock. "Keep looking at me," she said, pushing down harder on the wound. Warm blood soaked through the gauze, slipping between her fingers. The copper smell was overpowering. "You're not dying tonight. Who makes Henry his coffee if you die?" A dark, wet chuckle bubbled up from Gabriel's chest, turning quickly into a cough. "You do." "I quit. The hours are terrible," Maeve fired back. "Stay with me," the doctor returned, moving with frantic precision. "I have to dig the bullet out before I can clamp the bleeder. It's too deep. No time for local anesthetic to take full effect. Hold him down." The 2 guards moved in, pinning Gabriel's shoulders and legs. Gabriel's grip on Maeve's forearms tightened until she felt bruises forming. He didn't look at the ceiling. He didn't look at the doctor. He locked his eyes entirely on Maeve. "Do it!" Gabriel rasped. The doctor went in with the forceps. Gabriel didn't scream again. He bit down on his lower lip until it bled, his entire body going rigid as a steel beam. The muscles in his neck strained against the skin. Maeve held the pressure, her hands coated in his blood, refusing to break eye contact. She anchored him, just as she anchored Henry. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the sickening wet slick of metal in tissue, the harsh, ragged breathing of the men in the room, and the howling wind outside. "Got it?" the doctor finally breathed, dropping a deformed lump of lead into a metal kidney dish with a sharp clink. "Clamping the artery. Bleeding is slowing. He's going to make it." Gabriel's head fell back against the leather. His eyes fluttered shut. His grip on Maeve's arms slowly loosened, his hands falling limply to his sides. He was out. Maeve stepped back. The doctor took over, packing and stitching the wound. She walked over to the stainless steel sink in the corner. She turned the faucet on, the water running cold. She stared down at her hands. They were entirely coated in Gabriel's blood. The water turned a pale, watery pink as it circled the drain. She had thought her job was to protect an old man from a ruthless world. As she scrubbed the blood from under her fingernails, the cynical, cold reality settled into her bones. She wasn't just an employee anymore. She was neck-deep in the violence. The ledger wasn't balanced. It was bleeding, and she was the one holding the gauze. 3 days passed in a haze of antiseptic and hushed voices. Gabriel did not die. Men like him rarely surrendered to something as pedestrian as a bullet. He woke up 30 hours after the surgery, pale, furious, and barking orders at his lieutenants from the medical bed. Maeve stayed out of the way. She kept Henry occupied in the sunroom, playing endless games of gin rummy and lying through her teeth about Gabriel's absence. She told the old man his grandson was in Chicago, finalizing a shipping contract. Henry accepted the lie with a gentle nod, his mind comfortably wrapped in the wool of the fiction. On the 4th night, the estate finally fell quiet. The lieutenants went home. The extra security shifted to the perimeter. Maeve walked into the medical room holding a glass of ice water. The machines hummed a low, steady rhythm. Gabriel was awake. He was sitting up slightly, propped against rigid white pillows, the heavy bandages thick beneath his unbuttoned shirt. He looked like a ruin, but the flat, dangerous intensity in his eyes remained entirely intact. He tracked her movement as she crossed the room and set the glass on the metal tray beside him. "You lied to Henry," Gabriel said. His voice was a rasp, stripped of its usual smooth bass. "I protected him," Maeve corrected, pulling up a plastic chair and sitting down. She didn't flinch under his stare. "There's a difference, and you owe me for the dry cleaning. Your blood ruined my favorite shirt." Gabriel looked away, staring at the blank white wall opposite his bed. For a long time, the only sound was the mechanical click of the IV drip. The silence wasn't hostile. It was heavy with the things they hadn't said since she stood over him, holding his artery shut. "The men who hit the house," Gabriel started, his voice dropping into a dangerous register, "were a splinter faction of the Costa Syndicate. They thought I was distracted. They thought bringing a civilian into the house made me soft." "Did it?" Gabriel turned his head slowly. He looked at her, really looked at her. He took in the cheap jeans, the tired posture, the sheer, stubborn grit that kept her rooted in a chair beside a man who brought death to his own doorstep. "No," Gabriel said quietly. "It made me careless. I assumed my walls were high enough to keep the wolves out. I forgot that wolves don't climb walls. They wait for the gate to open." He reached out. His movements were stiff, his muscles screaming against the stitches. He picked up a manila folder resting on the edge of his mattress and tossed it onto Maeve's lap. "What is this?" she asked. "Passports. A new identity. A bank account routed through a shell corporation in Zurich with enough money to disappear permanently." Gabriel leaned back, closing his eyes, the effort costing him visibly. The Costa faction is gone. I spent the last 3 days ensuring every man involved in the raid was buried in the foundation of the new South Side development. But there will be others. There always are. You saw the reality of my life 4 nights ago, Maeve. It isn't a game. It is a slaughterhouse. Maeve opened the folder. The documents were flawless. The bank statement showed a figure with too many zeros for her brain to comfortably process. It was the ultimate payout. She could leave this stone fortress, leave the blood, leave the crushing gravity of Gabriel Rossi. She closed the folder. She didn't look at the money. "Does Henry know how to play gin rummy?" Maeve asked. Gabriel opened his eyes, a deep frown creasing his forehead. "What? Because he cheated twice this afternoon," Maeve said, leaning back in her chair. "He palmed a card. His dementia is real, but he uses it as a shield when he wants to win. He's sharp, Gabriel, and he knows you're hurt. He asked me why the hallway smelled like iodine. I had to tell him a guard cut his hand on broken glass." Gabriel stared at her, utterly derailed by the pivot. "Maeve, I am giving you the exit. I know what you're giving me." She tapped the folder. "It's a clean conscience for you. If I take this, you don't have to worry about my blood on your hands. You get to go back to being the untouchable king on the hill. But you're bleeding, Gabriel. Your grandfather is slipping away, and your empire is cracking at the edges." She stood up. She dropped the manila folder onto the metal tray, right next to the ice water. "I told you I negotiate my own terms," Maeve said, her voice dropping to a low, quiet hum of absolute certainty. "I don't run from a fight, and I don't abandon my debts. You brought me into this house to anchor your family. Now, you're stuck with me." Gabriel looked at the discarded folder, then up at Maeve. The cynical, brutal armor he wore for the world finally cracked, completely and irreparably. A slow, genuine smile touched his lips, a rare, terrifying thing that changed the entire landscape of his face. "You are a very stubborn woman," he murmured. "And you have terrible security," she shot back. "Drink your water, boss. You look like hell." Maeve turned and walked toward the door. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The ledger was finally closed. They didn't owe each other money, or favors, or duty. They owed each other survival. And in the dark, sprawling underworld of the city, that was a bond thicker than blood. What a wild ride. From a crumpled $3 bill to holding her own inside a ruthless mafia empire, Maeve proved that true power isn't about the money you possess. It's about the fear you refuse to show. If you loved this gritty, slow-burn dive into the dark and dangerous world of Gabriel and Maeve, make sure to smash that like button and share this story with your friends. Hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next epic storytelling series. Drop a comment below. Would you have walked away with the Zurich money? See you next time.